Most of humanity, currently about 83.6% of humanity, is egoic in its understanding of the world. It's interpreting everything through what is best for itself. Some people are, to your question about intelligence, some people are frankly a hell of a lot better at it than others. Until human consciousness elevates, which we are in process of doing, most of humanity is focused on itself most of the time.
That's what it was. I still look at narcissistic behaviors or tendencies. And again, there's that gradient scale. And I say, where does a behavior like that come from, though?
Narcissism is actually a psychological diagnosis. We've adopted this in our society to label anyone that we think is over the top selfish. The classic definition of somebody who's experienced narcissism in their life or has somebody in their life that they would label a narcissist inherently is so selfish that every decision they make goes through the filter of how this impacts me. They're constantly trying to manipulate their world to serve themselves. When I listen to somebody talk about the narcissist in their life, it is inherently that, right, at the cost of other people. That behavior is in almost every human being. It's just simply a gradient scale of extreme.
Hey, Sebastian, it's good to have you on the show. Welcome on my platform. I think we were just a few days ago, we were talking on your show. So I feel like this is part 2, but it'll be the first time my listeners probably get to hear you.
Yeah, I'm excited. And I had a blast on Monday. It was great getting to connect with you, and I'm excited to continue the conversation.
Yeah. So if we were just talking about, before this started, the book that has yet to be released and doesn't exactly have a release date because you're kind of a perfectionist, I take it, a little bit?
I wouldn't call myself one that becomes dysfunctional, but like I was saying, it's a Mark Twain quote that hit me, and I'm writing that, which is I didn't have time to write a short book, so I wrote a long one, and I'm trying to. I don't want to release until I'm happy with it, essentially. So.
Well, what's the title? Have you decided on that?
Yeah, How Not to Fuck It Up that's the working title. I don't think I'll end with that one, but that's the title I've been working under for a few years.
I like it. Okay, so it's funny that you're talking about going back and rereading it and editing. And I remember how I was sharing on your podcast that I write my own newsletters, and I do the same thing. I have to read it back to myself numerous times. I write it down in my notes, and then I go back and I edit it. And even still, once I send it to my person who puts the newsletter together and does all the hyperlinks, I'm like, you've got to send it to me because I got to see how it looks. Because just sometimes how it looks makes me want to change how it's written. And I'll go back, and I probably have an editing process. It probably takes me about 5 or 6 times before I feel like just a newsletter is refined enough to the point where I feel good about sending it out. So I can only imagine a book.
How long does it take you to put a newsletter together?
Well, I send one out every 2 weeks, so I'd probably say about 2 weeks. Yeah.
So you start as soon as that one's done, you're starting on the next one.
So my newsletter goes out every Thursday morning. So that's this morning, the newsletter goes out. And I was working on it still this morning. And last night I started next newsletter. So if that gives you any context, but it's important to me because it's my voice and it's something that's always going to be, I want it to be a place where people can look at it and say, hey, I'm really getting a thoughtful message communicated from Miesha and not just, run of the mill, trying to have a money grab, go to my website and purchase my stuff. That's not what I'm looking for.
What do you decide to talk about? Do you have a process or a routine?
I come up with a couple ideas and I'll kind of have those in a separate note that I can always refer back to. But I always am open to letting those inspirations that come through life just change the direction of a newsletter at any point. So I might have a baseline that I'm like, well, okay, nothing has really inspired me that much to create a newsletter about this week. So I'm going to go back to one of my base points, goal setting or something. But then sometimes something really monumental happens and it's like an epiphany. And I love when I have those moments. And I wouldn't say that it's super uncommon for me to have those moments where it's like, that was an awakening. That was a moment, like I'm so grateful. Sometimes it's as simple as a sunset. Sometimes it's going on a road trip with my family. It could be cooking dinner. It could be anything that inspires me in that moment. But if it clicks and it helps me to continue the path of betterment, then I feel like that's something that can be deserved to share with the readers.
I love it. Yeah, I can relate for sure.
Okay, so how did you decide what kind of messaging that you wanted to share in your book?
So I have 3 sons, and the goal originally was if I cash out of my meat suit unexpectedly, which I don't think is going to happen, but if I did, how do I build a life's manual that they could refer to? And so that was kind of my orientation. And then it was, the process of my own journey here in this particular lifetime, and then what I spend most of my time coaching around. I'm more or less been a coach most of my life. I certainly came in as a teacher, and that's really my reason for being here. It's like, okay, well, what is the most of the message? What is most of the people that I work with struggling with? And ultimately, it came down to identity. I have a degree in biblical study. I'm a third generation pastor's kid, for better or for worse, and so I had a lot of framing to the Bible early in life, and that gave me a lot of kind of grounding that allowed me to kind of see how the avatars over the years have showed up, including Jesus. And I mean, I think I mentioned it when we talked before. Before he started his ministry, the big question was, the big test was around identity. And I really believe most of what people struggle with here is tied to identity. If we simply remembered who we really are, everything would change. And the struggle, the adventure, the unfolding is really tied to that process of awakening to the remembering of who we are. Some may say creating who we are. That resonates. I'm cool with it. But ultimately, it's coming down to solidifying our identity. And so the core concept is closing the identity gap. And the identity gap is the difference between who we think we are and who we really are, or who we pretend we are, or we front that we are. And it's the ideal versus the real. And most of our ideal self is set before we're conscious. It's imposed on us by our family, our culture, our religion. And so we come in and are indoctrinated into a value system that may or may not be our own. And we haven't even tested it yet, right? It's very theoretical. And so a lot of the 20s is tumultuous for people because they haven't figured out who they are yet. They don't really know what they value. And a lot of what they think they value, they were told to value. And so they're living in their ideal self. And our power is found when we close that gap and we get back to authentically who we actually are, the real and the ideal. And so the closer we are to our real selves, the more power we have to actually create and move the needle in our life. We're pretty powerless when we live from the ideal place, and it's exhausting because it's not actually who we are. So we're not aligned. And when we're not aligned, we don't bear the fruit in our lives that we intend to. And if somebody's super lost in the sauce, they'll be very confused by this. And usually their framing is life is happening to me. They feel very frustrated. They feel like life isn't fair because they haven't recognized yet they're not living their true, authentic self. And that's most of our world, especially in Western society. We're pretty lost in fronting an identity that isn't truly us.
How do you help people go from ideal to real? What does that path look like?
Well, I think curiosity, right? I'm a big fan. My book really focuses on, there's 7 steps to mastery in any given subject matter, but the first step in all things is awareness. We don't change consciously until we're aware there is a need to change. And you and I had talked about before, there is a passive change that can happen if you're put into an environment that forces you to change, but it's an exterior sort of change. It's happening from our external change. It's forcing change on us, which can be effective to a certain degree, but because it's unconscious, it's limited. Whereas change that comes from within comes from usually the discovery of the fact that I want to change or I need to change, which first starts with awareness. And so for me, so much of my work is simply to prick awareness. Even my content, my social media content, which most of it is in front of an audience, is designed for awareness. That's it. It's simply to prick awareness, to create questions, to get people to think, to ask deeper questions. And so I think that's where you start. Like, hey, why do I do the things I do? Why don't I do the things I know I should? Why do I say I'm going to do this, but I do this? Why do I intend on following through on this, but I don't? Why do I say I'm going to go to coffee with this person when I don't even want to see them? Why do I commit to doing things that I really don't want to do? And so it's really getting people to ask the question why, right? And getting curious. And so as a personal practice, I have 2 reminders that go off I have a lot of reminders that go off on my phone every day, but 2 regarding this subject. 1 is question anything that seems obvious, and 2, question anything that doesn't make sense. I have found leaning into those 2 areas, there's a lot to discover. And so, yeah, a lot of my practice is simply creating space for people to become curious about their lives and the decisions they make, and understanding the needs, psychological needs that are driving their decisions, and then the value matrix they use to interpret and behave. And so we can have we can have the same need, but express it differently based on our values. And so it's really understanding that, and then, hey, where did that come from? Why did I decide to do that? Why is this what I believe about the world? And as we get older, a lot of these things become so pathological that change seems harder and harder. And I'm not certain that's the case, but it does seem the older we get, the harder it gets. And in the scientific community, for a long time, it was regarded if you didn't come up with a new theorem or a new paradigm of the world by the time you were 35, it was generally accepted that you would not, because your paradigm becomes very crystallized. And anywhere in our life where we are very certain about the way we see our world, the opportunity cost is we won't see it any other way. We become aligned with our story about the world, and the cost of that is it doesn't allow space to see it any other way. There was an old Buddhist teacher story that I've always loved, where he's teaching his students this concept, and they're writing with bamboo pens, and he asks them, "What is this?" And they say, "It's a pen." And he asks again, he goes, "What is this?" "It's a pen." "What is this?" "It's a pen." He grabs the pen and he throws it outside, and the cow begins to eat it. He goes, "No, it's food." And the point was simple. It's this, how we interpret something is largely dependent on our story and filter of what we think it is, right? And so most of us don't see, we see a flower the first time, and then every other time is simply the memory of the flower. That's the old saying, the greatest artists paint the flower the first time every time. The greatest lovers make love the first time every time, right? It's being able to come back to the present moment and reset our story or interpretation of the world, which is incredibly hard for most of humanity. I mean, there's design protocols that I think are quite useful, but they keep us from participating in life on a conscious level in many ways.
There's so much to think about there and so much to unpack, but I love where you're going with this. I think that the question of why is so important. And I dial it back to my children, 6 and 4 years old. It is a question they ask me all the time. They never stop getting curious about the world. "Mommy, why this? Why does the cow moo? Why does the chicken cluck? Why do they lay eggs? Why?" It's just everything is why. They're so curious about the world. But it goes again, probably hand in hand with the fact that their brain is learning and growing. And I think that if we want our brains as adults to learn and grow, we have to continue to ask that question.
Yeah, I totally agree. And not dissuade our children from continuing to ask that question. How often, if we aren't present, we're exhausted, we're tired, we have a lot going on, we get irritated with the question, and we either make up an answer or tell them because I said so, or whatever our story is to deflect the question, or they're literally asking questions we don't have the answer to. And so part of the modeling there for me is they don't have the answer. That's a great question. Why don't we find out together? And I say that with my children. I say that with my employees. I say that with my teammates. I don't have to have all the answers. But we do need to stay curious and continue to seek them. And so I think promoting a culture and a family that stays curious. Life is so much more fun when we stay curious, right? And trying to understand. And the world is infinite in its expression. So there's much to be learned and much to discover if we open our minds to that possibility.
When you're working with people and you're coaching them, do you find that the majority of people lack the curiosity or are more in denial?
That's a great question.
Because I think, let me elaborate a little bit on that. I think that sometimes people are aware of at least their behaviors. Maybe they're not taking a deep dive into why they behave that way, but they know that they could do it better or should do it better, and they just don't want to accept it. They don't want to take a personal reflection because that's difficult to do. And then there are some people who are a bit more oblivious and they really don't realize the impact that they're having because they're just not getting curious or even are aware of it. And I think in both situations, you lack some curiosity. However, I'm sure you run into moments where people don't like to get curious because it forces you to look at potential weaknesses, look at areas where you're not strong, look at areas where you need to improve. And not everybody likes to take that step back and say, hey, a lot of this is either my fault or I could control it and make it better if I put some effort into it.
Yeah, but there's layers to this. I would say my high-performing clients, almost one of the kind of earmark or telltale signs that somebody is a high performer is they tend to be naturally curious. I was just filtering through that. When I have clients that come to me because they're stuck, that's almost always because there's a lack of awareness, and it comes into one of two camps. They're either unconsciously incompetent or they're in denial. They don't want, like, the classic one is somebody who's shopping for advice, which normally just in their framing, I know what they're doing, right? And so somebody's shopping for advice, what they're hoping is that somebody is going to tell them to do something other than the thing they know they're supposed to do. And so for me, if I know I'm dealing with that kind of person, then the first thing I'll ask them is, I don't know, what do you think you should do, right? Which is an attempt to reveal the heart. But yeah, I do think there's different camps, right? There is the unconsciously incompetent, and then there is the consciously incompetent. In many ways, the unconsciously incompetent person is easier to help because you just need to create awareness, the prick of curiosity. Ask a question that I find that truth is very sticky, and so it isn't my responsibility to beat somebody over the head with truth, or even convince somebody of truth. Truth doesn't really need to be defended; it's pretty defensible. All you need to do is provide it, and it creates like a stickiness on the inside of someone when it gnaws at them, because it's like they can't deny it, and so they may try to hide it or not think about it. But if they start to open their mind and they really begin to try to solve the problem, it's going to keep coming up and keep coming up. And so I've had truth that I've spoken into somebody's life that like it was 3 years later, and then to this day I'll have guys text me and they'll go, "Sabs, I get it," and I know exactly without context. I almost always know why they're saying this out of nowhere. I get it now. And so I have found all I need to do is create space to provide truth to the degree in which I can speak it, and it will do its work. Once it begins to germinate, it will do its work. So yeah, but I do think denial is a big part of it, because as we talked about before, truth is inconvenient, right? We create a worldview that helps us make sense of our world, that helps us kind of navigate it, and most people don't challenge that worldview until there's enough pain that says, hey, maybe I'm missing something. And then to acknowledge something that challenges what you believe to be true can be tough for a lot of people. For me, that is one of the hallmarks of intelligence. Right? Intelligent people, one of my favorite questions to ask is, what do you do when you're presented with information that challenges what you believe to be true about the world? Well, I know what intelligent people do, but I would say the vast majority of people, it literally goes in one ear, out the other, or they immediately spin it to make their worldview make sense.
How would you define intelligent?
How would I define intelligence? The rate at which we are willing to change in light of new information, or the speed at which we change in light of new information.
I think that's a great description. And I wanted to ask you about narcissist, because we talked about it and I said, hey, I dated a narcissist for 9 years. I think quite the definition of a narcissist. And you kind of said, I feel like that was a term that, I don't know exactly how you said it, but you're like, it's not a term that I like to use all the time. And so I did want to elaborate a little bit on that, because I think that there are ways of being intelligent and using things in a manipulative way. And whether you define that as narcissistic or narcissistic behavior, I'm actually curious your take on it. But sometimes that intelligence, I feel like, in a way that where they manipulate the environment to benefit themselves, irregardless of the way that people feel by the way that they make those decisions. If they can get someone to agree to it, then in their mind it's okay, even if it's caused by extreme pressure or a manipulation tactic, not really a consideration of other people's feelings. And is that technically intelligence? They're taking information and they're changing things, but also at the same time, I feel like they reject information that doesn't benefit them.
Right. Yeah. So my comment about narcissism is this: narcissism is actually a psychological diagnosis, and so we've adopted this in our society to label anyone that we think is over the top selfish. Right. And anybody who, the classic definition of somebody who's experienced narcissism in their life, or has somebody in their life that they would label a narcissist, inherently is so selfish that every decision they make goes through the filter of how this impacts me, and they're constantly trying to manipulate their world to serve themselves. And that is, when I listen to somebody talk about the narcissist in their life, it is inherently that, right? At the cost of other people. That behavior is in almost every human being. It's just simply a gradient scale of extreme, right? It's egoic consciousness. There's an old saying that two egos will never meet. And it's entirely true, right? Two egos will never meet because the only thing an ego can see is itself. If we were really being honest about most of humanity is very obsessed with itself, right? And I'm not saying these are one and the same thing, but what happens then is we adopt these terms and they get super overused, especially in social media, and the actual meaning of the word gets lost, right? So when I just was coaching, I had a coaching client that referred to his wife as a narcissist. And the first thing I asked is, well, do you have a diagnosis? And he looked at me oddly, like, what do you mean? Like, did she actually get diagnosed a narcissist? He's like, no. Like, okay, so you're using a term to describe somebody who is insanely, in your opinion, insanely selfish and manipulating the world for their own gain. Yes, got it. But what happens is, then when somebody really deals with narcissism, narcissism. There are people who have narcissism. I have no idea. You may very well be accurate in what you're saying, and there was a diagnosis. I didn't ask you any of those questions. But it's such a term that is overused that I'm always very hesitant to go anywhere near that word for that reason. It's thrown around so much, and it's used as a way to beat somebody over the head that we don't like what they're saying, or we think they're being manipulative, or we think they're being selfish. But if we're being really honest, that is most of humanity. Most of humanity, currently about 83.6% of humanity, is egoic in its understanding of the world. It's interpreting everything through what is best for itself. Some people are, to your question about intelligence, some people are frankly a hell of a lot better at it than others. And sometimes we resent them for being really good at it. But until human consciousness elevates, which we are in process of doing, most of humanity is focused on itself most of the time.
So interesting. I know that my ex was diagnosed with some type of personality disorder, but off the top of my head, I recall, I'm not able to say what the formal diagnosis was, but I remember that's what it was. However, I still look at narcissistic behaviors or tendencies. And again, there's that gradient scale. And I say, where does a behavior like that come from though? And
survival.
Yes. So, as I've mentioned in the podcast before with you, that I'm a big fan of Dr. Gabor Mate. And this is where it gets interesting. So although I can say, hey, in my opinion, I believe that this person is pretty close to what I feel like the definition of a narcissist is. If I look it up, if I, read all the behaviors and these things. Okay. So you're close to that. But why? I go back and say, look at their childhood. It was extremely traumatic. They had a parent that was addicted to drugs, and they had another parent that was gone for whatever reason. And, they had drug addicts in and out of their house as a small child. They've been abused. So when did they start learning to survive? And when you don't raise children in an environment that provides for them to thrive, then they go inside and they just learn how to survive. And I think there are at least two ways that I could think of that would clearly describe survival as a child. One is I'm going to manipulate the environment around me in every way that I need to ensure that I survive, live, eat. And the other way is like I'm going to try to cater to my environment the best that I can so that I will be needed and hopefully not exposed, not discarded, I guess would be a lack of a better term. So when I think about those ways, it's very easy to understand how an adult person who has more narcissistic or more selfish behaviors probably came from a home where they didn't experience a lot of unconditional love and learned that, hey, I have to protect myself at all costs because no one else is going to do it for me. And then those just become habit forming. And it's so easy to throw all of the pressure and weight onto the narcissist or the person who is selfish, but we fail to dial it back to where it all came from and realize that these, I don't think that babies are just born like narcissistic or not. I think so much of our environment as small children really raises us with either a level of confidence or a lack thereof. And I do think that people who tend to have more selfish and narcissistic behaviors are actually some of the most insecure people. They're constantly worried and threatened about their environment and the security of it.
100%. Yeah, and I would challenge this a little bit only in that, and I agree with the overall assessment, the conditions in which we were raised have obviously a massive impact on how we see the world. However, I've seen now twice somebody who was raised in what they would have described a perfect family, wanted for nothing, were told that they were amazing, right, still show up with some of these tendencies. And so I think in psychology, there is the nature versus nurture argument that has gone on forever. And I think, as in most things, the truth is probably in the middle. There's an element of that is personal responsibility. You still, as a human, have a choice to how you respond to your environment. And then there is an environmental aspect of this that conditions us to see the world a certain way. And normally when you see extreme behavior, it is in response to an environmental condition for survival. And it's both, right? So that the giver and the taker, although the giver is generally a more palatable behavior, the giver and taker are often the same opposite sides of the same coin. The taker decided, I'm going to control my environment to get what I want, and I'm going to manipulate and tell people what they need to hear to get what I want in order to protect myself. The giver goes, I'm going to get what I want by making people like me, be happy with me, and I feel safe by making people, to have people approve of me. But it was really the same, and very often it's the same wound described different ways, which is why you can have, and I've seen many times, siblings who are raised in the same conditions who decide to interface with the world in completely different, the opposite side of the same wound. In other words, if we don't deal with our trauma, it can manifest in a couple of different ways. And very often, and I would offer, is potentially a loving story, although one that probably hard to accept. The giver and taker find each other in an attempt to wake up, in an attempt to remember, because there is pain. When the giver and taker find each other, there is a synergy that will bring them together as they both spin into their identities. And at first, if you read Attachment Theory, it's pretty fascinating. It's a short little book, but it's good on relational attachment and understanding how this shows up. But the connection spins up an identity of bond that eventually will burn itself out because of its imbalance, right? And there is an opportunity there for both parties to learn. Does seem the giver sits more in anabolic energy than catabolic energy. The taker tends to sit more in catabolic energy, simply meaning there seems to be an opportunity for the giver to wake up easier than the taker, but it's an opportunity for both to learn. And I think, to me, that's the reason for these engagements, right? If we look at it, to kind of put a bow on this, I guess, if we look at it like every human being, or we could say, maybe to be more accurate, every spirit that inhabits a human being, the meat suit, is a perfectly loving being. It only then plays the role necessary for our awakening in this realm, right? Which is, of course, the asshole test. Two people go, you're out with your friend, hang out with somebody, and you meet somebody for the first time, and they think they're amazing, and you think they're an asshole. Who's the asshole?
Yeah, good point.
Right? We see in others what is in us, which, by the way, is a loathsome statement for some people to hear. But if you have children, so no doubt you see this. Children don't judge. They don't even have story of judgment. They only inherit judgment as we impose it on them. When it comes to other humans, they won't label them, though they may pay attention to their energy, right? Much like an animal would. It's like they don't necessarily know this person and their behavior isn't what they're judging, but their energy they will judge, right? Because they can feel that somebody's energy is off, but they don't have, there's so many things that they don't impose on another human because it's not part of their filtering system. It's only over time that we impose those filters on our children that they begin to see the world in a more judgmental way.
Earlier you made a point in everything that you said, but it stuck out to me about these people who grew up with not needing for wanting. And I want to dig a little bit at this and maybe make a little bit of an argument here but I believe that the emotional availability of the parents is far outweighs anything that you could look at and say, well, they didn't need for want. They grew up with a nice house. They always had new shoes and new clothes and, they got a Ferrari at 16 when they, and they've never had to go a day, being hungry or being cold or being any kind of uncomfortable. They grew up with everything they ever needed. But what if that's because dad was never home, always slaving away, working? And what if that made mom depressed? And so she's painting a picture, she's taking antidepressants and she's emotionally unavailable. And this kid's kind of growing up this kind of secret feeling of like, something's missing and is it my fault? Am I not lovable? And so sometimes, even though these children look like they grow up with great, mom and dad are happy, they quote unquote love each other, they are raising these children, they always look nice, they're always presentable, they go to church, do all these things. But are the children really getting what they really need? And I think what they really need, you could live in a cardboard box and give children what they really need. What they really need is deep love and connection. And I think somebody to also help them navigate the emotions that they feel when they're so young. That's what I really think that our children need. And so sometimes, again, we're quick to look at somebody and say, well, how they have grown up like that? They had everything that they needed. Why did they ever turn to drugs? Why did they ever become addicts? Why did they have a food eating addiction? Why are they overweight? They had it all. And we sit here and we compare and we add and subtract and we try to, make ourselves feel better sometimes about, well, I had it harder and I'm still better for it and I'm okay and I did better than this person. And I just think that's such a mute point, because even when you have two siblings that grow up in the same house with mostly the same experiences, it's still an entirely different perception of the world. And even if you had twins, and one baby wakes up before the other baby, and so that baby's always the one that gets held first. And then the second one is left there to cry a little bit longer while the other one is mom's getting the bottle or getting the diaper changed. And this is a continuous thing. Just that perception, which is so interesting to think about how resilient yet how delicate life can be. And your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love that. I 100% agree with you. And to clarify, for me, if I say something once for nothing, it means they grew up in the big three: healthy in relationship, healthy in body, healthy in finance. So I agree. I have lots of clients who grew up wanting for nothing materially, but were starved for real relationship and connection. I think if anybody's grown up in an impoverished home, they understand how important money is, but it isn't everything. And you could grow up in a home where you wanted for nothing financially, but you had emotionally unavailable parents, right? And I think love and connection is all humans ultimately are driven by love and connection. Like, you can see the loving story in any behavior. In all cases, even the most traumatic, crazy cases, I promise you at the end of the day, that person is seeking love and connection. It's innate to who we are. So 100% agree. And I would say, to kind of take the pressure off parents just slightly, my point is, you can literally do everything right, or what is most beneficial. That does not guarantee that your child is going to be a perfect enlightened being as they drop in. And there's probably a number of reasons, including that there is a choice point for the human in front of you, that they still get to decide how they want to show up and what decisions they want to make. And then kind of taking it a layer back that perhaps is challenging for some, I would call Earth schoolyard Earth. It's like a university or a program where you come in here to learn very particular lessons. And so when you drop in, there is a curriculum. There is lessons that you are here to learn. And every single interaction that you come into with, the conditions you came in, your parents, the country of origin, all of that is built around a simple construct, which is to create the curriculum necessary for you to experience and learn whatever it is you are here to do. And so to me, that's also a loving expression and understanding, but it helps kind of go, okay, well, why do these things happen even when it doesn't seem like they should? Why do we continue to have these things in our society? And even Christ said, as an example, something that recently has been on my mind, he said, the poor will always be with you. Well, like, that's an interesting statement, right? Like, what does that mean? Does that take the pressure off us to take care of the poor? No, I think quite the opposite. But I think there's a lot that is learned in poverty that is important for humanity's consciousness. And most of, but not all, of the people I know who are very successful came from nothing, which was part of their process, part of what drove them to be more and to want more. Now, there are exceptions, undoubtedly, but the vast majority, and I think there was a big study that was done that showed in the United States, 81 or 82% of self-made millionaires, we could debate what self-made means, but self-made millionaires were first generation. They didn't inherit wealth to get there. There's something, I think, beautiful in the process of the human experience that includes suffering, or we could say pain, at least. Suffering may be optional, but pain seems to be part of this world, part of the learning mechanism for this world. So there's a lot there, but ultimately I think we're here to learn our lessons and the conditions that created. And so you could come in potentially in a perfect environment with perfect attentive parents who are emotionally available, create a beautiful home for you, have everything you need physically, financially, and emotionally. And that does not guarantee that you are going to be a perfectly enlightened adult who doesn't have any issues. And that was my point, is like, I've literally now seen this twice. And obviously, perhaps their perceptions they're missing things, but one of them I know, and I actually got to know the parents, and I'm like, oh, sure, shit, yeah, you're right about this. Fascinating.
Yeah, so interesting. I mean, they say it's 50% nature, 50% nurture, but I think in that 50% nurture, it's important to have the relationship with your kids where they feel like they can come and talk to you about things. I think that's where it goes different. Sometimes children know that they're loved, and that's really important, but are they still afraid of your judgment? Are they still afraid to come and ask you or tell you that something happened? As your child, for example, if they wet the bed or something, they're little and they wet the bed, do they come to you and say, Mom, Dad, I'm sorry I wet the bed? Or are they like, oh shit, if I tell Mom or Dad, I'm going to be in so much trouble. Let me try to cover this up, hide it, hopefully it dries. Like, what kind of feeling do your children, right? Do your children have about telling you things that make them nervous? And I think if we can help them to realize that 50% of nature can always be cross-checked with the 50% of nurture, and that will always be there for them, even in the hardest or most difficult situations. Someday when my daughter starts dating and has a boyfriend and, she has questions, or if he's pressuring her, I want her, to be able to come to me and say, Mom, what do you think? And I'm probably going to answer it with the question, well, honey, what do you think? What do you think? How do you feel about this? What do you feel? Do you feel loved? Do you feel nervous? Does it feel good? Does it feel bad? I just want to have a conversation with her to where I can help her navigate nature. And I think that's beautiful.
Yeah, I love that. The way I express that is we work as if everything depends on us, but we trust everything depends on God or whatever you want to allocate to that spot. So it's the tension is in the middle and understanding that all we can do, the principle is there, is the only thing we can control is ourselves. So we're going to do our best to show up as parents to the best of our ability and not impose our shit and our poor programming on our children, right? Which is easier said than done. And then to create and maintain relationship or connection that allows them to be open and honest with us. So we're not part of the problem. And unfortunately, most of humanity still operates in a form of shame and punishment that involves removing love as a way to communicate displeasure. And it takes an awakened being to keep your heart open, even in pain. But ultimately, change will happen in this world when we stop shaming people and judging people into change. Because we all know shame and judgment do not work to drive behavior long term. And teaching someone to disconnect and to remove their love and connection from someone that they are unhappy with perpetuates this cycle. It isn't solving problems, it's just compounding them. And anybody who's had a meaningful conversation with someone that you knew that they were perhaps disappointed in your action, they were hurt by something you did, but they had the courage to keep their heart open and continually lean into connection to understand, changes the entire equation of the conversation. Now, what am I not saying? I'm not saying you stay in an abusive relationship with somebody who is toxic. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that means that you continue to go back to relationships that are dysfunctional. Healthy boundaries are important. All of that is possible. It is possible to create boundaries. It's possible to remove yourself from negative situations and still keep your heart open. And I think the perfect example of this, or one of them that comes to mind, is Christ. He was being nailed to a bloody cross. And because he cared about connection more than anything else, he made eye contact with and had a moment of connection with the Roman soldier, Roman centurion that was nailing his hands to the cross. And the story goes, as much as the Bible refers, he dropped the hammer and walked away because he was so blown away with, I'm literally nailing you to a cross. In an effort to kill you, ultimately, in suffering, and you are so concerned with connecting with me that it rocked him to his core. And whether this is true or not, the legend part of this goes on to say that man went on to be Saint Germain, the great healer. Whether that's true or not, we don't know, but that moment of connection changed that Roman centurion's life so much that he dropped the hammer and walked away. Like, I don't know what to do with this dude. Like, in the moment of his greatest suffering, he's more concerned with connecting with me. And so to me, that's the great act. Like, how do we learn to keep our heart open even in those moments, right? How do we learn to live from our heart even in those moments? Because especially in Western society, we've learned to do the exact opposite. Most people live up here. And as a coach, a teacher, I can see it when I'm talking to somebody. All their energy's up here. I can literally see. It's like their heart is so disconnected from where they're speaking from and where they're thinking. And all of our power, going back to the identity gap, is connecting brain and heart. When we get those two aligned, now you have the power to create in the world. And so I think teaching our children that by modeling it, how even when I'm unhappy, perhaps with something you've done, or I'm disappointed, if you use those phrases, I still keep my heart open. I do not remove love and connection from you. It's hard because that gut reaction, most of us are trained to do the exact opposite.
You know, I want to say thank you, Sebastian, because I have been in a point of contemplation for quite some time. So with my ex, there were some situations, there was some debate over property and some actions that were taken by him that were not right, at least in my opinion. And some other things that he did that really got himself in trouble. I've been called by the court and asked to testify. And I've really been thinking long and hard about what the right thing to do is. Because if I testify, be playing a big hand in him going to prison for 2 to 5 years, federal prison. And he has a small child now. And I've been thinking, what is the right thing to do? Because, you know, telling the truth is never wrong. I never think that it's wrong. However, to go and say it in front of the court of law, then knowing the consequences would be, in my mind, wouldn't fit the crime, even though it wasn't right. He's not a murderer. He's not a rapist. Might not be the most stellar person on the face of the planet, but he's not, how do I say it? You know, I guess what I was going to say is that I think in talking to you, I had have my answer. And my answer would be to lead with empathy and kindness, not, any kind of vengeance or, hey, I'm going to teach you a lesson, which is I've been seeking this advice from many people. And many people have told me he needs to learn a lesson. He needs to stop doing this to people. You're not the first one. He's got to learn a lesson. But I also know that sending someone to jail or to prison doesn't teach them a lesson. So all I would really be accomplishing is taking time away from his relationship with his daughter and vice versa. So thank you for that.
There's a principle I operate from there. There's a few. One is that which we judge judges us back. If you stay the victim long enough, you will become the perpetrator. And though, yes, there are lots of opportunities in our life where we feel like somebody needs to learn a lesson, it is not necessarily our responsibility to teach them that lesson. And I call it the three voices. There's three voices that lovingly try to teach us lessons in life. The first is our conscience, the small, still voice that will whisper in our ear, don't do this or do this. And very often, depending on the season of life we're in and whether we want to hear it or not, we'll mute it. And a lot of people do. They mute that small, still voice and they stop getting anchored to their own guidance. If you ignore that voice, the next voice that comes is generally friends and family. They don't do this. This is a bad mistake. If we don't want to learn from friends and family for whatever reason, the next voice is by far it appeared to be the most unmerciful. It is a relenting bitch, but is absolutely merciful in its attempt, which is the world. And we don't learn if we don't listen to our small, still voice, we don't listen to our friends and family, the next one that comes along is the world. And the world's consequences are karmic in nature and they're insanely painful. But the beauty of that pain is it often is where the lesson is learned, which again, you see people dramatically change their life and become different people. It often, if you follow that line back, came from insane amount of pain and suffering that was the consequences of their decision. However, when we become the arbiter of that judgment, we enter into the judgment. And even, I don't know why I keep going back to Christ. It's not always a theme I come to, but maybe it's relevant here. I've always found Christians fascinating for a number of reasons. One of them is they really love judge, right? And Christ said over and over and over again, I did not come here to judge. So how do we have little Christs walking around thinking it is their place to judge when the one they follow said over and over and over again, I am not here to judge?
I think that's so powerful. And I'm really glad that I had this conversation so that I could come to that realization. And maybe that was the purpose of us connecting. For me, at least, what I will take away, and the biggest part, is what is the right thing to do. And a lot of people might have a hard time understanding why sending someone to jail or to prison wouldn't teach them a lesson. But I know you and I have touched on this a little bit, and I'd love for you to elaborate on what actually helps people grow and change, and why, statistically, it hasn't been very impactful to change people's lives by sending them away to isolation where they have less of the tools and opportunities to change, in my opinion. They would say surround yourself with who you want to, right? Like if you want to become more successful, you surround yourself with more successful people. Well, how does it make sense to take somebody who, has made a mistake and surround them with people that have likely even made worse mistakes? There's that part of it, but also the lack of opportunity for education. I think learning is so important. Having new resources, new skill sets, new ways of looking at the world and dealing with the world is the way that we really facilitate change, which I don't think is an opportunity that's ever or very rarely afforded inside of the four walls of a cement cell.
Yeah, I think there are, and I have done some prison work and worked with prison ministry when I was younger. So I think there are exceptions for our listeners to point out, because sometimes people may hear, no, this person changed. But as a whole, I would agree with you. Our system, as it is set up, does not promote growth or change and is really geared towards punishment. The bigger issue for me is when we perpetuate punishment, it continues to move it forward. So, although in context, I think I can infer what your decision is around this particular topic, and I appreciate just your authenticity and realness around it. In no way trying to persuade one way or the other with any of it. One of the issues with becoming the punisher is that it perpetuates the cycle. Okay, so what do I mean? Well, with him going to jail, it's not just creating a negative impact for him. It's going to create a negative impact for his kids, for the people around him, that perpetuate this cycle. Right? And when you see How often do you hear when you have people who are in and out of the system themselves say things like, well, that was my family. My dad, my mom was in and out of the system, right? It perpetuates the cycle. In order to create change, we have to do something different, right? It's insanity to do the same thing over and over again and think you're going to get a different result. You're not. And so it takes a much bigger person to forgive and to let go. That does not mean that people get off scot-free. The world has a way of creating karma, which sometimes gets caught into a religious concept and is not intended to. Karma is simply a universal law of homeostasis. The universe, the dimension that we live in, the first two dimensions we live in, is constantly seeking homeostasis or balance. Everything. It seems to be a universal law of this world. Karma is simply the balancing of energy. It's the balancing or the bringing back to homeostasis. So if somebody gets way over here, there will be a rebalancing of that energy that usually comes with a counterbalance to this side, which brings homeostasis. And so even though it is not our place to judge, and in many cases, unless that is literally our role, it is not our place to punish, that does not mean that one gets out of things. And so for the people listening going, no, they need to be taught a lesson, they will learn. But sometimes the lesson is in compassion and empathy. And how many times have I heard stories of somebody's life changed because they looked into the eyes of someone who genuinely loved them and showed them empathy and compassion. That does not mean to be their friend or their friend again. That does not mean you reignite a relationship with them. It simply means you show compassion and empathy for the human in front of you. And very often that is a life-changing event for someone. Now, if it is not, the only person you can control is you. So you show up as you because that's who you are. We have to surrender our illusion of control. It's concerning if I see somebody do something that seems good, right? But they're doing it because they're expecting a particular result or have an expectation of what it's going to lead to. For me, you operate from principle because you operate from principle. That's it. You release your story of what you think it should be, and you simply do what you value, knowing full well, kind of random example. When I was younger, I was always very concerned. I'd walk down the street and people would ask for money because I wanted to give everybody money. Like, if I can help, I'd love to help. And so what I learned to do was to trust my inner voice. And if my inner voice said, help this person, I do. If my inner voice is not compelled, I do not. But as soon as I give that person money, I have zero expectation with what they do with it. I don't go buy drugs, don't go drink alcohol. I have no idea what their story is of life. And it is not any of my business or my responsibility. I'm simply doing what I believe I'm supposed to do. And that is it. And I surrender the rest, which is, on our last conversation, we talked 3 illusions in the path to awakening. One of them is the illusion of control. And the illusion of control is surrendering the idea that I can control an outcome or an expectation or a story of other. The only thing I can do is control my decision. Full well knowing I may do something with intent, with a particular intent that may not play out. But I still did it because that's who I am, not because I expected something in return. And that, again, is a very hard thing for most of humanity to accept. And there are probably some that would say that is either unreasonable or not realistic. Like that's just not how humanity shows up. I would challenge anyone to go down that path and see what happens. It is a much more beautiful way to live when you live from principle and value because that's who you are, not because of what you expect in return.
Yeah, it's a matter of calculating what's important on the inside and not worrying about so much of the input from the outside. Because as you and I have talked before, I talked about finding my peace and what that meant to me and my relationship with God and how instrumental that was for me because I got to a moment when I retired from mixed martial arts and I had left, the relationship that I felt was very toxic. And I really was stripped down to the bare minimum of who I am, which was really hanging on by a thread at that point. I know that I've said I contemplated whether my life was worth living. I was in a very dark moment and I had such a broken value system that really wasn't adding to finding who I was. I didn't even know who I was. I wasn't really asking myself the important question of why. I was just very busy suppressing everything that I felt like was in my way. And all that mattered was becoming a world champion. And that's what I focused on. And it was so unfulfilling that even once I became a world champion, when I got that UFC belt, I felt on top of the world for maybe 2 weeks. Maybe I was really excited. I was doing all the media. I was doing a world tour. It was, with my dad, taking him, over to the East Coast where he's from, and I got to see his hometown. And it was so cool that all this was happening because of me, the great Miesha Tate, the world champion. And then after 2 weeks, everything went sort of back to normal. And I realized it fixed nothing, absolutely nothing. And I think that's when the moment of despair really started, because we all hold on to this idea, or many of us do, that if we can just achieve this, if we can just have this amount of money, if we can just have this nice of a house, if we could just drive this nice of a car, if we could just become this successful, then life will finally be enjoyable. And it's so far from the truth that I believe that people that hold on to that so tightly and think that it will fix everything, and then they achieve it and they realize that it fixes nothing, are more likely to attempt suicide or go through suicide because they maybe haven't discovered something you were going to say right there.
Thank you so much for sharing this. It's a beautiful transparency. I think a lot of people are going to resonate with it. But this is common among Olympic athletes, Olympic medalists. This is common among people who achieve high levels of success in business. Anyone who achieves a level of success in which their identity was tied to this, they are vulnerable to this ability. I would offer on the other side of this, it's also a privilege. Because imagine believing your entire life the answer was being a champion but never getting there, right? It's hard to, and I'm always conscious of this, one, growing up in poverty, and two, not living in poverty now, living a completely different life that I'm quite grateful for. It's hard to tell someone, for instance, money isn't the answer. Money isn't going to fix all your problems. By the way, Ecclesiastes sends the word. King Solomon says money solves everything, or answers everything, I think is the literal translation. I actually don't disagree with that, because money gives you options. But my point is, there are a lot of people that believe, if I just do this, I'll be accepted. If I just do this, I'll be happy. Only to realize if they don't do the inner work, it doesn't change anything. But here's the point, and I think it's a beautiful point. There is a privilege in getting there, especially early in life, right? And it may be a dark winter. It might be a dark night of the soul. It may be entering the void. And some people don't come out of the void. You're right. Some people cash out, right? They decide life isn't worth living when they come to that arrival. But the vast majority do the opposite. They wake, and it radically changes their view of the world, because they are now absolutely certain the answers they are seeking are not behind that door. Almost inevitably makes them look inward and goes, well, maybe there's something else to this. Maybe I'm more than a title. Maybe I'm more than a single accomplishment. Maybe I'm more than my bank account, right? And that's the going back, the deep remembering of who we actually are. And then here's the irony. We touched on this on Monday. Now you can go back into the ring and have a blast and enjoy it from a completely different orientation, right? Where now your identity isn't on the line. And again, these are all questions of identity. Who am I if I am not these things? And very often, true identity is found in the stripping away of things, not the addition of things. Said another way, most of waking up is unlearning, not actually learning. It's unlearning and remembering. And so I appreciate you sharing that. And I would offer, and I think you would probably agree, when you get to the other end of that, though, the great awakening is it offers you an opportunity to seek who you actually are. And you aren't any of those temporal things, even if you are a badass UFC fighter, which is awesome, right? That's still an incredible accomplishment, but you are so much more than that. And even if you didn't accomplish that, you're no less valuable.
Yeah, no, that, you know what? You just reminded me of a great blessing that I've had the opportunity to see what's behind the door and be certain that there is not the answer that I was looking for, and that it was internal and nothing to do with the external. That was a great gift for me. And I do think about people who maybe never got a chance to peek behind the door and think that maybe if I only would have gotten there, it would have fixed everything, and maybe never hit that rock bottom or faced it directly, knowing for sure that it's not the answers. That was a blessing. Thank you for highlighting that for me. And also, I wanted to know, have you ever seen a documentary called The Weight of Gold?
No.
You should check that out. The Weight of Gold.
I will.
It's such a great documentary. A friend of mine produced it, and she's just a brilliant woman, and interviewed a lot of Olympic athletes and professional athletes, and highlighted a lot of what we're talking about and the life after sport, and just putting so much into that, identifying with a specific outcome or sport or, whatever it may be. I think this could certainly apply beyond athletes. But it's a great documentary. I really recommend it. So as we are coming to a close, I wanted to know if there was anything that you could say for people who have started to get curious and started to ask themselves that really important question of why. And for me, when I first started asking that question and that really moment of pitch black darkness and there's a pinhole of light that I'm just running to and it's the why, but I don't know the answer. I don't know what's on the other side. And I think that's common when we first start asking that question. If we haven't been in touch with ourselves and our internal, then we are asking and we don't know the answer always. Sometimes it takes a long time to really start to hone in on an answer. But when we do start to feel like we're getting in touch with that intuition, we're starting to have some answers. Is there anything along that way or that journey that's actionable besides just asking yourself why that people maybe could take home, keep in mind as they go on their self-discovery journeys?
Well, I appreciate the question. There's a handful of things, and some of them we've already covered. I think one, orientate yourself towards truth, not right and wrong. So fall in love with truth seeking. Now, in human form, we mostly discover lowercase truths, not uppercase truths. We may asymptotically approach an uppercase truth, but we're mostly just, at best, swapping out a lowercase truth for a superior lowercase truth. Well, this is why we pursue truth. And so it's the ability to let go of something in light of new information that demonstrates a superior truth and understanding. So staying curious, seeking truth, and removing your story of identity from things that are temporal to the degree in which you can. So I have a practice in which no matter how amazing my day was or how bad my day was, I have a visual altar, if you will, that I go to, and I lay down all of my titles, all of my accomplishments, all of my pain, all of the insults, and I lay it all down, the good and the bad. And I surrender it as a nightly practice. And I go back to I am, period. I am, period. And I recreate, the name of my company is Phoenix, I recreate myself on the daily. Now, that doesn't mean it's a brand new reset. It just means I'm willing to let all of these things down. I don't hold any of them so tightly that I'm willing to surrender who I truly am for those things. That has helped me a lot in surrendering stories of identity that keep us stuck. By the way, normally when we get angry and we get into arguments with people, it's because we're treading on identity. And I know this, if somebody gets super emotional on a particular topic, it's almost always an indication that their identity is tied to this truth or tied to their story of the world, which alerts me to be more sensitive and more empathetic to where they're coming from so that I understand how to relate and connect to them. So beyond that, I would stay curious. I would ask questions beyond just why, and understand you touched on this, but in this particular lifetime, there were questions I was seeking that I didn't get for 10 years. I just didn't stop asking. But some of them I got 10 years after I started asking the bloody question. And I would inquire sometimes, like, why did it take so long to get this answer? And part of it is there are truths that if we are not ready to hear, best case scenario, they fall on deaf ears, they fall away and we forget them. Worst case scenario, we become inoculated or calloused to that truth because although it is obvious and apparent, because we've heard it so much, we've conditioned ourselves to deny it, meaning it makes it even harder to receive it or accept it. Or we just don't have the framing to really get it. It may be a discussion for another podcast, but there are lots of things that I think are true about the world that humanity is not ready to receive, and so it is not readily available. And so, although I love truth, and this may be a contentious belief system, I do not think everybody is ready for the same truth at the same time. Thus, what truth is shared is somewhat relative to the population or audience you are sharing it with. And Jesus knew that. He shared in parable when he spoke to 3,000 people, right? Because the masses could not understand half of what he said. He lamented. And Paul said the same thing. I want to give you meat, but I have to keep giving you milk because you aren't ready to hear it, right? In Jesus's context and conversation, what he shared was very relative to the group he was with. The bigger the group, the broader the topic. And he spoke more in parable. The smaller the group, the more specific he could get. But even with his own disciples, there were things that they didn't understand. They still thought he was there to conquer Rome. He's like, yo, I didn't come here to conquer Rome. This kingdom isn't mine. I'm like, what are we talking about here? They're like, and he's talking about his temple, and they're totally lost in, wait. You're not here to conquer Rome? So there's a lot of truth that you have to prepare yourself for, right? Simply because if the programming isn't set, it isn't going to land. And so in that, then we trust, and I would say capital T trust, and we pursue truth while removing those things that no longer serve us. And my line of thinking is, it's Byron Katie's The Work, which I think is fantastic, but it's a framing off of that I really love. And so when I'm working with my clients, and a lot of my clients come to me around stories of identity, I do a lot of work around identity. And so one of my favorite questions is a line of thinking that asks, it's 4 simple questions, and 2 of them are essentially the same question. First question is this true? And so let's say, using an example of a couple. My husband doesn't put the toothpaste cap back on the toothpaste because he's trying to piss me off. I know he's doing it. It's intentional. I'm being silly here, of course, but this is real if anybody's married to get it. Is this true? Yes, it's absolutely true, right? It's absolutely true. This is personal. Second question, can you be absolutely certain this is true? Now, if you hear this line of questioning and you've got stories around maybe our currently elected president, maybe apply it the same way. It might be fun. You might learn something about yourself. Second question, are you absolutely certain this is true? Now, depending how committed somebody is to their emotional condition, they may quickly wrap back, of course, I'm absolutely certain. And if you sit there in silence, they'll probably soften a bit and go, well, no, I can't be absolutely certain. Great. Now the crack of light. Took 2 questions just to get the crack of light. Maybe what I believe isn't true. Maybe not. How does it make you feel believing this is true? Not great, not fair, not secure, not loved. What would it be like for you if this wasn't true? Oh my God, I'd live a completely different life. I'd have a completely different story about my life. Right, and then there's turnabouts from there. But it's just those 4 questions, and it's all to get somebody to see that they aren't seeing the world objectively. They're seeing it subjectively, and through their subjective lens, they are willfully suffering. Right, and so it's the pursuit of truth and the denial of our own suffering. It's like you're not doing anybody any services believing that they're bad, right, or believing they're doing something to hurt you. You're not hurting them. You're hurting yourself. And so it's the stories about our world that we create so much of our suffering. And so our ability to change those consciously changes the game. And so hopefully that helps. But that's kind of where I would start with that process. Lean in.
No, I think you dropped a lot of knowledge and a lot of truth bombs right there. And I think people may need to go back and at least re-listen to the last 5 minutes of the things that you said, because there's so much to unpack there and so many conceptual ideas, I think, that will, like you said, turn into steak, but start with the milk. So I appreciate everything. You've done such a great job communicating some great points, and I really appreciate it. And I'm also super grateful for what I took away from this personal conversation, and can't wait to share with listeners. So thank you so much, Sebastian.
Thank you. This has been fantastic. I really enjoyed it.